backdrop of an organization as we stumble into the intelligence and the knowledge economy, how have human resources management philosophy and practices changed over the period of time to adapt itself to this reality?
Okay. The biggest way knowledge economy and the specialization has changed is that we're more and more reliant on one or two key people. So the impact that one or two people may have in even a large organization is much greater than it was 5, 10, 20, 30 years ago. And when we look historically, a lot of our HR practices come from a time of industry, manufacturing. That's really where things like assessment, training got their start. And now that we're in a situation where it's not a question of picking 500 out of 1,000, but really picking 1 or 2 out of 1,000 that can really have an impact on your organization. So with that said, the shift does change to finding what we might consider diamonds in the rough or low base rate events. So for example, think about sales. Sales happens every day. People can do it well. They can do it poorly. Customer service interactions happen every day. And you can see those observations every day. So in a certain sense, our HR practices are designed towards those kinds of observations, bettering those kinds of behaviors. And certainly those have an impact. But what now, as you move to knowledge economy, what has an even greater impact are things that don't happen every day. So for example, innovation. How often does true innovation happen at a firm? If you're lucky, maybe once a year. In some cases, once every 3 years. But when that does happen, that's a seismic shift in the organization. So now you're tuning your practices to how do I develop, encourage those kinds of behaviors. Another example in the opposite would be integrity. So in the financial services industry or otherwise, you might find certain people who, with a single bad behavior, with something simply not aligned with corporate policy or governmental policies, can have a tremendous adverse impact on the organization. That one person who does something incorrect or inappropriate can trump 1,000 people who are doing their sales or customer interactions correctly every day. And similarly to that vein, you have the notion of leadership. So if you look at an organization, you may only have 1 or 2 true leaders in your organization. An organization of 50, 100,000 only has 1 CEO. So by definition, that's a rare event. So those are 3 kinds of examples that we're seeing, and that means the HR practices need to shift to where they're focusing not on everyday events, but maybe the rarer occurrence that can have as much an impact, if not more, than 100 people.
How do we measure the impact of human resource investments in achieving enterprise goals?
The first step in looking at human resource impact is being realistic about what we can and cannot achieve. So in a certain sense, we look at revenue, we look at profitability, or we can even look at things closer to the HR professional's mind, like retention. But in many of those cases, an HR intervention is only part of the solution. If we look at retention, we typically find HR intervention, the individual can be as little as 50% of the contributing factor to whether somebody stays or leaves. Other factors like the economy, other factors like their age or their tenure can have as much, if not more, of an impact on whether they stay or leave an organization. So with that in mind, it's a question of what it is that we can control and defining it that way first. Another example we might look at is revenue by a store or general revenue by an organization. And if you're enrolled for 1 year, how much have you really had a chance to impact or control? So what we have to do typically is first define what we can control by the individual and then start to measure that. One example would be looking at year-over-year growth rather than year-one growth. So once we start doing it that way, we find ourselves with much more specific, concrete, intangible pieces of things that we can control. And that's how we can start to measure things more reliably. If you start with too broad a picture or things that you can't control, what's likely to happen is that you either find no result You won't have an opportunity to really identify how to quantify that result, and you'll find yourself frustrated by the inability to link those results. So people often ask, how do I know my HR implementation, intervention is impacting the bottom line? And the first thing to say is, well, what are all the other little things that contribute to the bottom line first? And let's talk about how we're changing the needle on that. And then we can talk about the bottom line. But if you're starting with too big or too broad or too abstract a concept, people are just too difficult to pinpoint and define in such a specific way. So we need to specify our outcomes as much, if not more. Last point. So when we're talking about assessing individuals or identifying whether they fit for a role or an organization, we can't speak in the abstract. So a good example here might be looking at your frontline employees, your folks 1 or 2 years into the job, or 3, and you want to find which of those employees is ready for a management position. We don't want to start talking about the abstract and say who has managerial potential or who's good at coaching and managing others, who has that people skill. Those all sound good, but they're too abstract. And by that I mean when we're assessing people and looking at people, we can only do so much. So if you ask me to give you a report on this person's strengths and weaknesses across 10 abstract concepts, I'm not going to do a very good job at that, and most people are not. But if we ask a more specific question, can this person have a coaching interaction with his team? And we give them a specific assessment around that, or a challenge-based assessment, we are much more confident, much more capable of telling you, can that person do or not do that task? So if we look at things that are more measurable, that are more specific, then we can start to see an impact on the bottom line. Another example might be, suppose you have a challenge in your organization of people not being able to manage a P&L properly, not understanding the finance, not understanding how the finance impacts the organization. But if you give them an accounting test, if you give them a reasoning test, if we ask them a host of personality questions and interview, I'm getting a lot of information around the point, but I haven't actually asked them to review a P&L statement. And what I'm suggesting is we're much more accurate if we narrow down on this actual task that we want them to perform, give them some closer idea of that task, not something as abstract as an assessment, but something specific to that task. And then we can give you a much more reliable measure on can we improve that skill. And then you're likely to see the outcome of that more directly.
Strategic analytics and business partnering to the C-suite. Mm-hmm. Traditionally in Sri Lanka, HR has assumed a more administrative role and practice. What are the challenges HR professionals and CEOs face in developing HR functions as internal business partners, so as opposed to maybe accounts?
I think once you move up to the organization, you start dealing with more C-level folks. Their concerns can often be different than the folks you were interacting with previously. So one example would be revenue growth, strategic initiatives, innovation, whereas if you're an administrative function, it's usually about cost reduction. So we've been very good at identifying HR practices to reduce cost. What we have a harder time doing is talking about what we can do to help you innovate, or what we can help you to create more accurate decisions for strategies, how we can find people who are willing and have the entrepreneurial spirit to go into growth market opportunities. And that might resonate to growing organizations, whereas cost cutting may be part of it, but not all of it. So what that means for HR professionals is they have to learn to talk about a broader scope of policies and outcomes. So what that means is ultimately we have to be more comfortable talking in terms that people understand and want to hear, and be a little bit better at linking what we do to those elements. So not necessarily my payroll administration is going to be more efficient, or my compensation structure is going to allow us to reduce cost, but how can I find employees who are willing to innovate? How can I find employees who are going to help you make better strategic decisions? And once we start talking in those ways, we're talking about things that might not only be requirements for the C-suite, but actually encourage or excite the C-suite to give more time and consideration to talent challenges. Another way that we'll probably have to address in the short term is being better consumers of data, better consumers of statistics, and better consumers of data from a variety of different sources. On that last point, I'm sure we'll talk more about data, but on that particular last point about different sources, there's no reason that HR professionals shouldn't be looking at things outside of typical HR metrics. So we should be introducing, as part of a KPI, actual business outcomes, revenue. We should be introducing in those business outcomes things that we wouldn't have considered before, like outside factors. What is the economy like in that person's geography? What is the characteristic of the workforce in that person's geography? One of the things we might find, or we have found in some markets, is even within a country, each location, depending on its own emergence as a power, can be quite different. So that means the challenges faced by somebody in one city might be very different than that in another. And we need to know the characteristics of those cities themselves. Someone phrased it once as secondary data is probably not being taken advantage of in the HR field. The socioeconomic status, the educational status is something that should be considered in the kind of recommendations that we give to senior leadership.
Chelsea, you know what I mean?
Yes, yes. The innovation with big data is something we've talked a lot about in the region, and really is drawing a lot of attention. And in a lot of ways, the assessment folks, the organizational psychologists, the organizational behavioral psychologists who've been working in organizations have been doing a lot of what we're calling big data now for 20, 30 years. And then really, to me, it's bringing a scientific, analytical mindset to human challenges. So we're seeing big data in the marketing sphere, we're seeing big data in the finance sphere. But we think we've actually been doing a lot of this in isolation in the HR field, but now it's being given a lot more attention. So people are listening more and more. I think there was a study out recently that via big data identified that extroversion, gregariousness, being social with others improved customer service interactions. And it was trumpeted as some insight from big data. But in reality, that's been in the literature for 30, 40 years. But now the difference is people are listening. And we're getting more of a platform to talk about how data and people can be linked for business outcomes. So in that sense, it's a real boon. On the other side, however, I think people are starting to get involved in what's being called big data or data-driven HR who may not have the experience in dealing with this kind of issue before. And where mistakes might occur, usually in two areas, is one in using the wrong data. So we have plenty of data available to us, both from social network sites, both from biographical data. In some organizations and some jobs, we can track nearly everything you do the course of your day. Electronic monitoring in certain places like call centers has been going on for 10 years. And now think of all the data that we have on this person that we may or may not use. And if we're using the wrong data, you might actually be reducing your ability to make a proper decision. So the first thing here is educating people on what are the kind of data that should be used in HR practices, which are the ones that are going to help you, and which are the ones that might be detrimental to you. A recent study talked about onboarding and the use of social network information to predict onboarding speed for a person coming into an organization. And what was found was the number of connections you had. So if I was connected to 30 people in an organization and my colleague or other person coming to the organization was connected to 500, the person with 500 connections would not necessarily be onboarded more quickly, but rather there was one or two key people in the organization to which if either one of us was networked to, we would certainly onboard more quickly. So if you look at the data superficially or the wrong data point, you might come to a very wrong conclusion, whereas the right data point was there all along, you were just missing it.